It's been a while since I've talked about Jovian16. I mean, I've mentioned them recently by name and some of the, I guess you could say, takes on, shape-shifting and all that. But I haven't really talked about them individually because, of course, some of those stories, like Trouble TROs, are the kind of stories that, visually, if you were to showcase what they look like here on the YT, you'd be risking potentially your channel, maybe maybe at least very less, if you will. You'd be risking monetization, if you get my drift. But anyway though, the one thing about artists, storytellers, for these very, I guess you could say, very, it's early, guys. I'm going to get ready for work in a little bit. But these very, I guess you could say, NFSW, shapeshifty, melty, gooey stories. The one thing about them, especially when they go to webcomic form, is it takes time. And sometimes it takes more than just, like, let's say, a couple of months or something like that, maybe even half a year. Sometimes it takes a year in total, maybe 2 years. Mainly because what happens is, basically these writers will, these creators, I should say, will basically write stories, and they will conclude them in a sense to where basically, like I said, they will conclude them in a sense to where a continuation is going to happen. You just don't know what's going to happen next. And all you can do in the comment section on a Patreon or a DeviantArt or wherever is just speculate. Or even come on to a platform like YouTube or podcasting like Spotify and all that and speculate. And when it came to Jovian16, two of the more prominent stories that they've been known to do, I should say, outside of Brianna's Secret Life, if you will. I think that's the other one they just recently concluded for the time being. The other two outside of that one were Nanoshift, which they are continuing right now, and Amanda and Nicole. And Nanoshift, of course, as I've mentioned before with that here on my channel, it's basically about a young girl that has nanobots, liquid nanobots installed into her, making her pretty much immortal, if you will. Not, not invincible, but immortal in a sense, because basically it allows her to shapeshift into whoever or whatever she wants, or even melt down into a puddle of goo for relaxation. It even gives her the power to temporarily give anyone around her the opportunity to be, disguised as somebody else, or be a different version of themselves, like she recently did with a male companion of hers that, she's part of a team of, because she's going to be going on a mission. Basically, she changed him into a more muscular version of himself, with her nano powers, shape-shifting powers, that is, and let's just say they had a good time after that, temporarily. And then even previously before that, she did this to two of her friends that she's also working with as well, giving them new looks and all that, and even turned herself into a car so they can get to their destination. It also allowed her to essentially, as she was discovering these new powers, not only realize she can be somebody else, and even, let that somebody else be the prominent, person, if you will, be the prominent persona. But she also realized that by allowing herself to be somebody else and, let that somebody else she becomes be the dominant persona, that she could also split herself in, 2, maybe 3, and then that 2 or 3 versions of her would not only acknowledge, basically where they came from, but they would act on their own. They would act of their own accord, but still acknowledge how they came to be. Like when she first discovered her powers, she split herself in 2, and the 2 versions of her that were not her, but just 2 identically different individuals, had a good time, lesbian and FSW-wise. And the way they refer to Jay, that's the main character, the one that has the powers, that's J-A-E, the way they referred to her, basically was, as a separate being. In other words, in the third person, if you will. They referred to her kind of in the third person, like basically she was, as I said, her own individual self, separate from them. But, they, being two different versions of her split, acknowledged that they came from her, or something like that. But anyway, to get back on point here, the reason I bring this up is because the other story series he did was Amanda and Nicole. And Amanda and Nicole was basically, in a sense, very similar in tone. Now, Amanda and Nicole didn't get infected by nanobots, no. Instead, they had discovered this spell book that when they enchanted a certain incantation, a certain spell, it gave them, the abilities, if not permanently, the abilities to become whoever or whatever they want, even melt down into goo, if you will. And let's just say they had a good time with it, not just with each other, but with others, but now mostly with each other, because the end result, as I talked about before, and I even did a video saying when this happened, I said I called it. Did I call it or something like that? Well, it was not exactly on Amanda and Nicole, but it was something similar. But to get to what I'm saying, when I was talking about it, a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, because I think that's when it concluded for the time being, in a review, I have to go back and look at the video. In the review, I kind of acknowledged that I did kind of figure this was going to be the direction, I should say, that they were going to go. And the direction they went was both Amanda and Nicole, mostly I think thanks to Amanda, or was it Nicole? No, it was Nicole, I think it was mostly Nicole. They decided to fuse into one, and they became basically another woman. They became one person, a sorceress, if you will. And basically at the encouragement of, I think it was Nicole, Amanda and her let their thoughts join together and basically become one thought. They acknowledge that still, separate individuals, but they're thinking alike, if you will. In other words, it's kind of like what you would see in some of those classic animated shows or live-action movies or whatever when this happens, or when this kind of thing happens, to where they're thinking of themselves as individuals, but they're both speaking mentally in the mind at once, to where it's like, we, must, and all that. But it's the speech bubble is doing it in a way to where it's not, copying, the same word of we, or I, and all that. No. Instead, the speech bubble, the thought speech bubble, the thought bubble, I should say. The thought bubble is a blending of purple and pink, representing both girls. So it's kind of like a mesh, if you will. That's kind of how it was. As they were beginning to do the fusion and all that, to differentiate themselves. So the thought bubble is like a mesh, if you will. It's a mesh of both girls' thoughts blended into one. So instead, like I said, of going the we, I, we, mut, and all that, it's just this thought bubble, kind of like a mishmash of purple and pink. Excuse me. Like I said, it's early. Purple and pink. Basically is a representation of them thinking the same thing, at once, basically on the same wavelength. But what's interesting is the fusion that has yet to get a name, will probably get a name very soon when the continuation continues, or the next part comes up. But the fusion does acknowledge, does say, one of the first things that the fusion says is, now what do we do for an encore, or something like that. But then, not even a few pages in, the fusion also starts to refer to themselves as I, and they do that more often. They kind of equal it out to where she will acknowledge we, basically acknowledging who she is combined, but just slightly more she acknowledges herself as I. And I brought this up in a comment on Jovian16's Patreon, and I said that, it seems that the fusion is starting to refer to herself as I, and then that would make things really interesting, if the time comes, Amanda and Nicole want to defuse. And the reason I say that is because, and Mr. Internet Man, who's helped out with the stories at times, for both Jovian16 and Topo TRO, or at least influenced them, and where to go. He did a story, a webcomic story, a couple years ago in time for Halloween. We had two characters that had, been seen before in a previous webcomic he did. And he had these two characters, who are witches, if you will, witches, sorcerers, whatever you want to call them, shapeshift into seductive versions of themselves, very seductive, voluptuous versions of themselves. And what happened is he then had them, as they're making out, he had them basically start to fuse together into one, and they became, as a result, one witch, one sorceress witch, very powerful. And what was interesting is at the end, is that the fused form, just as they're starting to say we, all of a sudden they change it immediately to I, am going to be this, I'm going to be that. And then the fused form is like acknowledging that, basically the two characters that made her, are not going to be missed, or basically are not going to be needed for right now. In other words, she's taking the fused version, the fused witch that they became is now taking a prominent role. Basically, basically she's indicating that even if they want to defuse, she's not going to let that happen so easily. And that's why I brought up the comment, that's why I brought up the comment on the Patreon page, saying at the end of this recent chapter, this recent continuation, which is chapter 12, which is called the Exciting Adventures of Amanda and Nicole. I can't say the other word because, again, YouTube algorithm. But basically, I commented and I said that, and I said that for the reason of, again, it will make things interesting. Let's say Amanda and Nicole want to defuse to maybe, let's say, go check in with their family, or they have to do this or that, but they have a promise to do this again, defuse again. To me, like I said, I mentioned in the comment that it's going to make things sound interesting, or sound interesting, but also make it interesting when that moment comes. Because if you're having the fused version, already acknowledging themselves as I, just a bit more, just slightly a bit more than, saying we, which is, again, an acknowledgement of how she came to be in the two, in her, merged mind. When you have that fused version slightly refer to themselves as I, a little bit more than, we, again, that makes things a little bit more interesting. It makes things a little bit more interesting. And even Mr. Internet Man, he did a long comment on the Patreon page, and even he, kind of in his own way, kind of sees exactly what this might entail to in the future. Now, what's interesting is the way it ends is, they decide they want to go and pay this receptionist who seemed seemed very smitten with them when they were individuals. They decided they're going to go pay her a visit and bring her up to their place for some fun, as the fusion they are. And I commented something that, was really interesting, and I didn't get no like yet from Jovian16 because I know they're busy probably working on the other stories, and they got life as well, personal life. But, anyway, I noticed that on two of my comments didn't get, kind of a like. Because sometimes immediately you'll get a like from the creators. And I looked, I looked what they were going to do. I saw the receptionist they were talking about. And I said to myself, and I commented, because I was thinking about this in my mind. I was thinking to myself, what if that receptionist is more than what she seems? And so I just put in a comment. I said, watch her, that being the receptionist, turn out to be Exotica or Demonica, which are two characters created by Mr. Internet Man, who are also shapeshifters. They're mischievous demon elf shapeshifters who basically reside within the human bodies of the human alter egos, Veronica for Demonica and Rebecca for Exotica. And again, I was just thinking in my mind, I wonder. So I just put that comment in there, and I haven't got it liked yet. So that's either telling me that I'm off, or when you don't get a like, it kind of tells you that maybe you're onto something. They just don't want to kind of hint at it, because if they like your comment, they're basically hinting at you're pretty much on the trail, if you will. Because again, the other comment I made is, with the fusion referring to herself as I, it's going to make things interesting when they want to defuse. Now, with Trouble TRO, in his recent Pink Benefits continuation, he's having the two shape-shifting bisexual girlfriends, lovers, if you will, Betty and Emily, meet back up, because Betty, she's a secret agent, or kind of a secret agent, and she has to basically originally she had to basically wait it out in this kind of like apartment complex hideout, whatever, with her boyfriend slash husband, and she was getting bored. And she was trying to buy at the time by shape-shifting, and by shape-shifting, she would do so into an enticing form to try to get him to have a little fun, to loosen up. And she basically said, let it be known, look, I'm just getting restless here. And her husband, is like, I know, but it's about patience. It takes time, so which means it could take days, before they get, filled out on the mission. So finally, Betty's able to entice him just enough to where he's like, okay, fine, go find Emily, go spend time with her, have fun, and I'll let you, but he's letting her know, hey, when we get the information, I'm gonna let you know. So, she's off getting ready to meet up with Emily, and the way they ended that story, Trouble TRO, that is they're gonna play a little bit of hide and seek. Basically where they'll become different people, maybe different things, maybe even melt, and all that, so that the other would have to find them. And then, they'll basically go and have a very quote-unquote good time after that. But the reason I bring up Trouble TRO's Pink Benefits, the recent one, if not the recent chapters, if you will, is I said that, I didn't say, but I asked them, would this potentially, imply fusion? And he basically along the line said, maybe, maybe. And with Trouble TRO telling me that, and then liking one of my comments, where basically, Betty and Emily agreed to meet up with each other and have some fun. And I, in the comment, I said, part of that fun is going to probably include fusion. Guess what happened? Trouble TRO liked it almost immediately. I wouldn't say immediately, but not that long after they liked that comment, when I talked about potential fusion, them merging together. And what that tells me is, yeah, we're more than definitely going to see a fusion finally, because Pink Benefits has been going on for a long time, and they both have this power now to become anyone or anything they want, even melt down into puddles of goo, become liquidy goo and possess people and give them the powers temporarily and stuff like that. And like I said, it's early, guys, I do apologize. And I almost had a brain fog there too. And, basically, the one thing we've not seen them do is fuse into one. Again, like I said, they have the ability to possess people by being liquid goo and basically going into the bodies via the mouth and basically spreading out within them and taking over, possessing them. And again, like I said, giving them the power that they have. But, despite that being probably the closest to a merger, which it is, but it's mostly a possession merger, we've never seen them, individually fuse into one. And what makes things interesting with Emily is she is right now within the body of somebody else. So she's got to retract herself from that body eventually, because she's giving that person a long, probably longer than I think anybody else, a long run with her powers. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly where they go. And I've got a feeling she's going to basically either remove herself from that, remove herself from the body to meet up with Betty, or what's going to happen is she's going to meet up with Betty in that body. That's how she's going to play her hide and seek part, and then she'll explain who it is, and then maybe Betty at her and then maybe Betty at her request or, acknowledgement, will have Emily get out of the body, reform back into herself, because again, you don't know exactly what would happen, and we go from there. But we'll see. We'll see, because Emily did say that she plans to explain why the identity she has is actually the some person wearing her, and not the other, and not them being, not Emily being in a, different form. But again, I bring this up because of the fact that when I commented about the fun these two are going to have meeting up with each other, and I mentioned that it could include fusion, and then I asked Trouble TRO if fusion will be a part, and them answering maybe, and them liking, that comment of me saying fusion will be part of the fun, that pretty much indicates that that's what we're going to be getting. And it will make things interesting, especially when Betty goes back to her husband/boyfriend to, get ready for the mission. Because what if the fusion they become allows them to shapeshift into each other, and Emily goes along with Betty for the ride? That, to me, will make things interesting. But I was also thinking about this, too, not to get off topic anymore, or to get off topic of Amanda and Nicole. But it got me thinking, what if the husband kind of has a clue as to what might happen, and just, as Betty's coming back, makes it look like it's Betty after the fusion, he's like, "Oh, hi, Betty," and then he goes like, "Oh, hi, Emily," and then he hits something on, or he, shoots something at his girlfriend, wife, if you will, like a zapper or something like that, and it causes them to defuse. What if that happens? That would be interesting, kind of surprising, but it would be interesting. And then, the reaction of the girls could be like, "Well, why'd you do that?" And I could see, the husband, boyfriend going like, "Look, I don't want to have to risk 2 lives just because you two want to have your fun." He says, "We need to take this seriously." And he'll probably point to Emily and say, "And Emily, for the time being," and then maybe he puts something down that prevents her from escaping even with her powers, says, "You're staying here, you're going on the mission," or something like that. Again, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it would make an interesting twist. But more than likely, we're going to get a fusion to where both will be as one, individual, mostly as Betty, and they'll go and, go on this mission without detection. That's what I'm thinking. But again, not wanting to get off topic, but like I said, the reason I bring that all up, is because Trouble TRO liked those comments about me, or liked the comment where I basically said the fun could include fusion, and everything. The fun could include fusion. They liked it. But, Jovian16 didn't like the ones I brought up. Now, I'm not saying that they're not eventually going to like them. They probably will. But to me, when you don't have somebody liking something immediately, because Jovian16, did like some other comments, after mine, after my comment was made, my 2 comments, again, it's early, guys, I do apologize. But basically, they did, like a couple of the comments that came before and after mine, well, mostly after mine. So what that tells me, and I know I sound like I'm rambling, I do apologize, but what that tells me, essentially, in reality, what that tells me is that by not liking my comments just yet, it almost sounds like, to me, they know I'm onto something. They know I'm pretty much onto what could be the next step, or what will be involved in the story. And I seem to have a tendency for that, I really do, because one of the things that I've noted before here on my channel, when it came to me and Ian Flynn, who's the head writer of who was the head writer of Archie Sonic, and someone is still head writer of IDW Sonic and a consultant on the Sonic Sega team, the one thing that kind of put a little bit of a, I guess you could say, a divisive, division between me and him, and between him and other fans similar, is I was always able to pretty much, through my reviews, if not through my monthly opinions of the Archie Sonic book, I was able to figure out exactly, what was going to be the next step. Like, with some of my monthly opinions, I was able to figure out and go like, "Oh, I know what's going to happen. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen," or more than likely things are pointing towards that, more than likely things are pointing towards this. And most of the time, I would be right. In fact, somebody even at the Sonic.am message board even indicated that. I mean, I said basically watch Nicole be the key. I think it was during the soft reboot, the beginning of it. I said watch Nicole be the key, and she was. You know, be her the Deus Ex Machina key, and she was. So I can understand maybe that one, they're too busy right now working on other stuff and with personal life to like all the comments. So I can understand that. But two, it also gives off the vibes that with them not liking immediately my comment, unlike Trouble TRO, it almost feels like, in my opinion, they know I'm onto something. They know I'm pretty much, you know, figuring out, oh, I think I know where they're heading with this. Or, oh, I think I might know who else might show up. Because when I was reading Nexy's comics, that's Nexy, Nexy, if you will, when I was reading their comments on Unconventional 2, you know, I had no idea. Well, actually, I did have an idea because I read the ending. I read some of Unconventional and mostly the ending of it. But no one, even reading the original Unconventional, no one knew that Mr. Internet Man's character Demonica was going to show up, and she did. You know, she did show up. She showed up and everything, and helped these girls have some fun. You know, even and this is something that I was alluding to earlier. Even going as far as to not only possess them individually, separately and individually, because you know she has that power, but also melting them and merging them into one. Basically, melting them into goo, into a blobby goo on the bed, and then merging them into one, which she did. And I said in one video in response to that, I said, I called it. I knew it. I knew that was going to happen. And it did. And it did. And basically, like I said, I would not be surprised if maybe that's what happens here. Because again, Jovian16 did like a couple of comments that came after mine. Maybe a bit before, but mostly after. But they didn't like mine. Now, they didn't like Mr. Internet. Oh, no, they did like Mr. Internet's long comment on theirs, on their new chapter for Amanda and Nicole. But he didn't like mine. Now, he didn't. No, true. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff that comes up, so you're not going to like every comment. But something is just telling me that the reason they didn't like what I had to say, comment-wise, about hey, the fusions referring to themselves as I now. And everything, and that can make things interesting if Amanda and Nicole want to diffuse. And then my other comment of watch the receptionist, turn out to be either Exotica or Demonica. And to me, what that tells me is one, like I said, and I do apologize, I've been repetitive, like I said, it's early. But one, what that tells me is either he's too busy, working on the other comics he's doing, as well as for personal life to make, to like everybody's comment, which is understandable. But mostly, I think what it really tells me as well is outside of that, which is a strong possibility, but outside of that, I think they know I'm onto that. I'm onto what's going to happen next. Or at least something similar to it. It's like they know I'm onto what's going to be the next stages in the story. And whether or not this receptionist turns out to be more than what she is, whether she does turn out to be Demonica or Exotica or maybe even a sorceress of her own, that's a little bit more powerful than Amanda and Nicole combined, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, one of the thoughts I had was, what if whoever this is, whether it is Demonica or Exotica or maybe somebody else with equal if not more power, figures out who this girl is or this woman is, and uses her power to separate them, and then explain, hey, you should be happy I separated you because your fusion was referring to themselves as I and not we. Maybe if that's the case, she points out, oh, and she was referring to herself as I and, mine. She was using all these different words more so than we. Maybe that happens. Maybe that's what occurs, and Amanda and Nicole get, pretty much a lesson of, oh, being a fusion is great, but we can't stay in that form for too long, and maybe we need equal acknowledgement and partnership, because, when one thinks about it, I think it was Nicole that was the one that kind of initiated the fusion more so than Amanda, and it was more her, so she kind of had like a slight edge. So to me, it's like, what if that is the case? with this receptionist is either one of those three situations, maybe not. And she basically, tells him, tells him who she is, what she's about, and then explains, after she diffuses them, that again, don't stay in this form, in a fused form, for too long unless it's equal consent. In other words, like it's an equal agreement of being one individual. Because if there's like a slight take on, not equal, it's not a slight take, but a slight advantage over the other, then that could cause trouble, or whatever the case might be. But yeah, again, I know I sound like I'm rambling. I do apologize. It's early, but the thing I'm getting at, ladies and gentlemen, is when one looks at this story, it's going to be really interesting, to say the least. And like I said, it's one of those stories that if you've read this kind of stuff for a while, you've been a fan of it for a while, like I have, you kind of have a clue, you kind of have an idea of exactly what the next step is going to be, or at least where they're heading in the story. You really do. So to me, when I look at Amanda and Nicole's situation right now, and the fact that the fusion just very, 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 very itty slightly is referring to themselves as I and everything, more so than we, that again tells me, that's telegraphing, in my opinion, what could potentially happen. And again, with the receptionist, she just might be a normal girl that's into kinkiness. It's a very extreme NFSW magic melty, kinkiness, if you know what I mean. She might be that kind of girl. I'm not saying she is, but then again, looks can be deceiving, so we don't know. We may not know. I mean, one story that Triple TRO is working on with Mr. Internet Man is a new story. It's called like A Night to Remember or something like that. And the girl that's in there is is more than what you seem, especially at night. So it's going to be interesting to see what they go with on that point. But that's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying here. Like, this receptionist could be more than what she seems. And she might have the power. Either she is a Mr. Internet Man character like Exotica or Demonica. She might have the power to say, okay, diffuse, and everything. She might have that power. Not saying she will, but she might. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. But anyway, though, guys, I know it sounds like a ramble, but I wanted to come on here and talk about the return of Jovian16's Amanda and Nicole series. I highly recommend checking it out. If you want to know more about it, I would suggest, it's all over the internet, believe me. You can find the whole story on the internet. But I suggest, checking it out from the beginning, and working your way up to chapter 12. And once you get to chapter 12, or mostly chapter 11 and into chapter 12, you'll kind of get an idea of exactly what he's planning, if you will, and maybe even have an idea of could this be what they're going for, and could this receptionist be more than what she seems? But anyway, though, guys, I just wanted to come on here and talk about that. I know, like I said, I rambled a bit. I do apologize, but I just wanted to give you my thoughts and everything. And really, that's about it. So until next time, guys, I will talk to you later. I got to get myself ready for work, get my lunch and everything together. But guys, do me a favor, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video. Also, click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere outside of YouTube and everything, as well as click on the Teespring store at the bottom. The Teespring store link, I should say, at the bottom of the description to find merchandise you can't get anywhere else. Again, I do apologize. It's early and everything. I got to get myself ready for work and all that. But let me know what your thoughts are, guys. And until next time, I am out.